Have you ever felt like you've reached the pinnacle of your life, a peak of success, wisdom, or influence, only to find yourself inexplicably slipping, making choices that defy everything you once stood for? It's a common human struggle, this insidious drift, where the very strengths that elevated us can become the blind spots that lead to our undoing. We often believe that intelligence and wisdom are impenetrable shields against life's greatest pitfalls, don't we? That if we are smart enough, wise enough, we can navigate any storm, avoid any personal catastrophe. But what if I told you that the wisest man who ever lived, King Solomon, didn't just die a peaceful, natural death, but his final moments, the very full of his life, were shrouded in a divine judgment so profound, so devastating, it shattered his unparalleled legacy and tore an entire, glorious kingdom apart. The story of Solomon is not just one of golden palaces and profound proverbs, it is a chilling testament to the fragile line between divine blessing and human frailty, a narrative so rich with psychological tension that it forces us to confront our own capacity for both greatness and utter ruin. The Bible, ancient historical texts, and even modern archaeological findings, when pieced together, paint a picture of Solomon's end that is far darker, far more complex than simple old age. What history books don't often tell you, what Sunday school lessons rarely explore, is the very specific hidden reason why this man, blessed by God with unparalleled wisdom, met such a tragic spiritual and political collapse, an end that holds a mirror to our own vulnerabilities and asks a terrifying question: if Solomon could fall, what hope is there for us? Now, before we delve into the devastating truth of his final moments, let's travel back in time, back to the golden age of Israel, a period of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and power that owed everything to one man's extraordinary intellect and God-given discernment. Imagine a kingdom stretching from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt, a realm where silver was as common as stones in Jerusalem, and cedars as abundant as sycamore trees in the Shephelah. This was the world shaped by Solomon, the son of King David and Bathsheba, born into royalty but chosen by God for something far grander. From the moment he ascended the throne, Solomon stood apart. He wasn't like other kings who sought power, wealth, or glory for their own sakes. In a moment that defined his reign, standing before the altar in Gibeon, God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything his heart desired. What did Solomon ask for? Not long life, not riches, not even the defeat of his enemies. He asked for wisdom, an understanding heart to govern God's vast people, to discern between good and evil. This was a request so pure, so selfless, it delighted the Almighty. And God didn't just grant his wish for wisdom, he threw in the riches, the honor, and the peace as well, promising a kingdom unparalleled in history, if Solomon would walk in God's ways as his father David had. And for decades, he did. Solomon's wisdom became legendary, drawing queens from distant lands like Sheba, who came to test him with hard questions and left utterly astonished, confessing that not even half of his greatness had been told to her. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, composed 1,005 songs, and his knowledge extended from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He was a master architect, designing and overseeing the construction of the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, a structure so awe-inspiring, so grand, it became the dwelling place of God's glory on earth. This temple, 7 years in the making, was the spiritual heart of the nation, a monument to a king whose devotion seemed as unshakable as the mountains around Jerusalem. His wealth was staggering, 666 talents of gold arriving annually, more than any king of the earth, but it was his wisdom, the divine gift, that truly set him apart. Now, you might be wondering, how could a man so blessed, so wise, so divinely favored, ever fall? How could the very individual who authored Proverbs, a book filled with timeless admonitions against foolishness and idolatry, possibly succumb to the very pitfalls he warned others about? This is where the story takes a dark, almost unbelievable turn, a psychological descent that is often understated in popular narratives. The Bible simply tells us that Solomon reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem, and then he slept with his fathers. A quiet, seemingly peaceful end for a king who had achieved so much. But then, almost immediately, the entire kingdom, the very bedrock of David's dynasty, shattered into two warring factions, plunging Israel into centuries of conflict and decline. This swift and brutal fragmentation, occurring right after the death of the wisest and most prosperous king, is the first great mystery surrounding Solomon's end. It doesn't make sense for a simple, peaceful succession. There has to be something more, something deeply wrong that had festered beneath the surface of that golden age. This is where the accepted narrative cracks open, revealing a hidden truth that explains the catastrophic aftermath. The real question isn't just how Solomon died physically, but how his unparalleled wisdom, his divinely bestowed gift, could not save him from himself, from the very human weaknesses that proved to be his undoing. What history books often fail to emphasize is the profound psychological toll that unchecked power, immense wealth, and strategic compromises took on the man who was once humble enough to ask only for discernment. The seeds of his fall were sown early, almost imperceptibly, even as God continued to bless him. The Lord had given clear commands to the kings of Israel: do not acquire many horses, do not accumulate vast quantities of silver and gold for yourselves, and crucially, do not multiply wives, lest your heart turn away. These were not arbitrary rules, they were psychological safeguards, designed to protect the king's heart from the allure of foreign influences, from the spiritual seduction that inevitably comes with worldly attachments. But Solomon, in his pursuit of diplomatic alliances and perhaps, in a subtle shift of reliance, began to ignore these divine warnings. He began to accumulate wives, not just a few, but 700 princesses and 300 concubines, many of them foreign women from nations specifically forbidden by God: Phoenicians, Ammonites, Edomites, Hittites. He married the daughter of Pharaoh, a pivotal but dangerous political move. At first, perhaps these were just political chess pieces, symbols of his international influence. But as the years wore on, and his heart grew less attuned to the divine whisper and more accustomed to the clamor of earthly grandeur, these wives began to turn his heart away. Slowly, subtly, their gods became his gods. Their altars became his altars. Think about the sheer, overwhelming psychological burden of managing 1,000 relationships, each with their own cultural and religious demands. Imagine the constant pressure to please, to accommodate, to compromise, not just politically, but spiritually. It wasn't an abrupt conversion, it was an insidious erosion. He built high places for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the abhorrent god of the Ammonites, on the very hills surrounding Jerusalem, the holy city where his magnificent temple, dedicated to the one true God, stood. Your mind can barely process the hypocrisy, the profound contradiction. The man who dedicated the temple with such fervent prayer, who had personally experienced God's glory filling the Holy of Holies, was now allowing the most vile, child-sacrificing cults to flourish literally within sight of God's house. This isn't just about moral failure, it's a profound psychological mystery. How does unparalleled wisdom morph into such profound foolishness? How does a man so close to God become so utterly estranged? The Bible doesn't give us a blow-by-blow account of Solomon's internal struggle, but it paints a picture of a man drowning in his own success. The very wisdom that brought him wealth and wives became obscured by the demands of those very things. He became too reliant on his own judgment, too confident in his ability to manage the risks, believing his wisdom would protect him from the consequences of spiritual compromise. This is where the mystery of his death truly deepens. His physical death may have been natural, but his spiritual and moral death began much earlier, a slow, agonizing demise of his once pure heart. And God, who had appeared to Solomon twice, who had blessed him beyond measure, did not remain silent. The divine judgment was not a sudden, arbitrary act, but a direct, inevitable consequence. In 1 Kings chapter 11, we hear God's thunderous voice, speaking directly to Solomon: "Since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son." This wasn't a prophecy, it was a firm declaration of judgment, a sentence passed while Solomon was still alive. This is the shocking truth historians discovered hidden in plain sight: Solomon's kingdom began to fall apart before he even took his last breath. The consequences began to manifest even in his lifetime. Adversaries rose up against him: Hadad the Edomite, a survivor of David's conquest; Rezon, a former servant of the king of Zobah, who became a raider; and most significantly, Jeroboam, one of Solomon's own officials, a powerful and capable man whom the prophet Ahijah met and symbolically tore his garment into 12 pieces, giving 10 to Jeroboam as a sign that God would tear the 10 northern tribes from Solomon's son and give them to Jeroboam. Imagine the agonizing final years of Solomon's life, the constant threat of rebellion, the shadow of divine judgment looming over his son's future. The peace and security that defined his early reign were replaced by unrest and fear. The psychological tension must have been immense. Here was the wisest man, who had written about the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom, now living under the direct, chilling threat of the Lord's judgment. So, when the Bible states that Solomon slept with his fathers, it's not just a euphemism for death, it's a profound understatement of a life that ended in spiritual tragedy and political upheaval. The true revelation of Solomon's death isn't about a specific cause of demise, but about the profound, irreversible death of his legacy in his own lifetime. He didn't die a heroic death, he died a man consumed by his own compromises, witnessing the very fabric of his empire fraying before his eyes. Let me tell you what witnesses actually saw in those final moments. They saw a once glorious king whose final years were plagued by the consequences of his own choices, a king who had lost his divine favor, and with it, the very peace and unity he had once personified. The kingdom, built on his wisdom, was now being ripped apart by his foolishness. This is the part that changes everything about how we see this death, how we understand the fall of the wisest man. The actual death of King Solomon was not a single event, but a drawn-out, agonizing process of spiritual decline. He didn't die suddenly, but slowly, bit by bit, as his heart turned away from the God who had given him everything. His wisdom, once a beacon, became shrouded in the smoke of idolatrous altars. His judgment, once impeccable, became clouded by political expediency and personal gratification. The image of the temple standing majestically in Jerusalem, while just outside its walls, on the Mount of Olives, Solomon had built shrines to pagan deities. This stark contrast perfectly encapsulates the tragic duality of his final years. It was a visual representation of his divided heart. His death, then, was less a physical end and more the culmination of a deep spiritual tragedy. He died a king, yes, but not the king of Israel God intended him to be. He died with the knowledge that his own actions had sealed the fate of his kingdom, condemning his son, Rehoboam, to inherit a divided land. The lamentations recorded in Ecclesiastes, often attributed to Solomon in his later years, resonate with this profound sense of disillusionment and the crushing weight of vanity, of meaningless, everything is meaningless. Imagine the man who had achieved everything, possessed everything, understood everything, concluding that it was all ultimately futile. This is the sound of a spirit in decline, a soul wrestling with the emptiness of worldly pursuits when God is forgotten. Why does this death matter so profoundly? Because Solomon's fall wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a seismic event that irrevocably altered the course of biblical history and, by extension, world history. His death immediately triggered the prophecy of division, splitting the united monarchy of Israel into the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. This division led to centuries of internecine warfare, the rise of idolatry in the north, and ultimately, the downfall and exile of both kingdoms. The glory of David's unified realm vanished, replaced by political instability and spiritual compromise. Every subsequent king of Israel and Judah, every prophet who cried out for repentance, lived in the shadow of Solomon's fall. His choices had consequences that rippled through generations, right up to the time of Jesus and beyond. The lesson from Solomon's tragic end is perhaps one of the most vital moral teachings in all of Scripture. It's a stark warning that wisdom, power, and prosperity, if not rooted in unwavering devotion to God, can become the very instruments of our destruction. It teaches us that compromise, even seemingly small ones, can lead to an insidious drift away from our core values and spiritual foundations. Solomon's story forces us to confront the reality that true wisdom isn't just about accumulating knowledge, but about consistently applying that knowledge in alignment with divine truth. It reminds us that integrity, faithfulness, and a vigilant heart are far more valuable than all the gold and wisdom in the world. His life, and ultimately his death, serves as a timeless object lesson. The path of least resistance often leads to the greatest ruin. It reminds us that even when we are at our peak, blessed beyond measure, our greatest vulnerability lies in the subtle allure of worldly enticements and the gradual erosion of our spiritual guardrails. But there is a profound form of justice in Solomon's story, even in its tragedy. The justice served was not a dramatic lightning bolt, but the unyielding principle of divine consequence. God, true to his word, allowed Solomon to reap what he sowed. The kingdom, which he had received as a gift and expanded through divine wisdom, was torn from his lineage, not because God was capricious, but because Solomon himself chose to break the covenant. This isn't a story of an arbitrary punishment, but a demonstration of God's unchanging nature. He blesses faithfulness, and he holds accountable those who turn away. The resolution, then, is not in a happy ending for Solomon, but in the unwavering truth of God's sovereignty and his commitment to his promises, both of blessing and of consequence. And through it all, even in the darkness of division and decline, God preserved a remnant, a line through which the Messiah would eventually come, ensuring that his ultimate plan would not be thwarted by human failure. But if Solomon, the wisest of all, could fall so dramatically, losing his divine favor and shattering his own legacy through slow, insidious compromise, what does that say about our own ability to navigate temptation and maintain our spiritual integrity in a world full of distractions and alluring compromises? What happens when a leader, entrusted with immense power and divine blessing, defies God so openly that his very death becomes a chilling prophecy for his people? The next shocking mystery we uncover delves into a king whose pride became so monumental, so defiant, that his very defiance became a shocking prophecy of his own brutal end, a story so intense, so visually striking, it redefines what we understand about divine consequence and human arrogance.